Okay, thank you, Mathis, for this introduction. So yeah, as Mathis said, I will be talking about conceptual combination. So yeah, I'm going to start with a statement of the problem that we're trying to solve, or that we're trying to build a model of. Now, as many of you are probably aware, when we hear complex linguistic expressions like nested sentences with main clause and subclause, and maybe even a subclause within the subclause, or just a long discourse with multiple sentences in the row that somehow relate to each other, then we understand the meaning of that in virtue of first understanding the meanings of the individual words, which we refer to as concepts. So being able to understand what a word means is essentially synonymous with possessing the concept of whatever it is that the word denotes. So for example, understanding what a cactus is really means that possessing a concept of a cactus. And in addition to understanding the meanings of individual words in a sentence, we also understand the syntactical arrangement. This usually happens unconsciously, but yeah, in order to determine the meaning of the whole, of the entire discourse or entire sentence, we need to understand not only what the individual words mean, but also how they are grammatically related to each other in order to arrive at an understanding of what the entire linguistic expression means. So we combine the meanings of words with their syntactical or grammatical arrangement to determine the meaning of the whole sentence. And what we are interested in is what are the neural processes that bring about this cognitive feed. Now, this question is very generally put. This is essentially the guiding question of the field of cognitive linguistics, and it would be bold to claim that we actually have solved this, but this is where it's going. This is what we're building towards. And as a first step towards this, we focused on an idealized scenario where there is a speaker and a listener that perceive a shared scene, and the speaker tries to guide the listener's attention to objects in that scene through language. So for example, the speaker might say something like, there's a cactus below the tent and above the camel. Find the blue object above that cactus. And yeah, our model then models the neural processes for understanding that phrase on the side of the listener, effectively finding the object. So to give you an intuition for what this may look like, here I've highlighted the attended objects in bright. So as we process the first part of the sentence, like there's a cactus, attention is divided between all cacti, and then the speaker continues, there's a cactus below the tent, then attention narrows down to the two cacti that are below the tent, and then the speaker continues, and above the camel. So there's a cactus that's both below the tent and above the camel, so attention is narrowed down to the one cactus that is both below the tent and above the camel. And then the first sentence ends, so this cactus is then the target of the first sentence, and the second sentence starts, find the blue object. So attention on the listener side is divided between the three blue objects. And then the sentence continues, above that cactus. Find the blue object above that cactus, which means the cactus that was described in the first sentence. So then attention narrows down to the one blue object that is above the previously described cactus. And I'm now going to describe a model that does exactly that. But before I do that, I have to give a little disclaimer. We're not modeling this process all the way to the raw speech input. So this here is a depiction of what's called the parallel architecture by Ray Jackendorf, proposed by Ray Jackendorf, who was a pupil of Noam Chomsky, if that's a name to anyone. And this is essentially a function level description of how language processing might work in the brain. And this serves as a rough guiding picture of what we consider to be the different processing stages from the raw speech input to the interface to our model. So in this parallel architectures, raw speech input is analyzed phonologically arriving at the sequence of phonemes or speech sounds and how they are divided into words. And this is then analyzed syntactically, arriving at some representation of the grammatical structure of the sentence. And there are huge debates about how such structure is represented in the brain. We don't have a strong position about that right now. We're considering multiple alternatives, but don't get confused by this tree image. It doesn't mean that the brain actually represents trees like that. It only means that whatever mental representation is used in the brain contains somehow the information that is also contained in this tree. But yeah, let's not go into detail there, because this is not where our model starts. Our model starts actually one step later at what's called a conceptual structure, which is a mental representation that encodes the meaning of the sentence rather than its speech sounds or grammatical roles or something. So that's like, you can think of this as a mental representation that encodes the same information that can also be encoded in some logic. Now, again, don't misunderstand this. We're not claiming that we represent sentences in terms of logic. All we're saying is that there must be some mental representation in the human brain that is structurally similar to what might be encoded in some logic, or alternative that might also be depicted as a graph structure. And again, we don't claim we're representing graph structures in the brain. We just claim that we represent something that's, you could say, structurally similar, or that contains the same information as such a graph structure. So for example, this two sentences that I previously said, there's a cactus below the tent and above the camel. What if information is in that? Well, there's a cactus, there's a tent, and there's a camel. And the relation between the cactus and the tent is that the cactus is below the tent, just sketched as an arrow here. And that same cactus is also above the camel. And there's a blue object that's above that cactus. And yeah, our model starts essentially from a representation which contains that information. So we assume that the language preprocessing system that we do not model maps the natural language input to a sequence of processing steps that essentially describe the conceptual structure, or that that contains the same information as the conceptual structure, and on the other side guides our architecture towards finding the described objects by activating appropriate process nodes and concept nodes. So I'm just going to go through this sequence once intuitively, and later you will understand how these process node and concept nodes actually achieve their grounding. But just to give you an intuition, the first step, when the sentence says there's a cactus, this is like told to the architecture by activating a select target candidates process and a cactus concept node, effectively causing the three cacti to be selected as candidates for the first sentence. Then the sentence continues below the tent. So first we select a reference object, namely a tent, store that in the reference field, and then we eliminate all target candidates that are not below the tent. And we continue, the sentence continues, and above the camel. So we continue by selecting the camel as a reference object and then eliminating all target candidates that are not above the camel. And then the sentence is finished. So we select a target for the first sentence, and then the next sentence starts, find the blue object. So we select a set of blue target candidates, and the sentence continues. Yeah, first, okay, we select a set of blue target candidates, then the sentence continues above that cactus. So we select a reference object, which is a cactus, but not just any cactus, but we activate an additional node that's called from mental map, which essentially means that we want to use a cactus from that we previously grounded that we previously found in the scene and stored in a working memory called a mental map. And now we want to eliminate all target candidates, that is, all blue objects that are not above this previously grounded cactus. So this is just to give you a rough intuition for what the architecture has to be able to do. We're now going to go step by step through the individual components of the architecture, and then you will gain an understanding for how these processes then achieve their appropriate effect in the architecture in order to ultimately generate a peak in a target selection field, which is the result of the grounding process. So the goal then is that the architecture autonomously finds a matching object and creates a peak on the position of that object in a target selection field, receiving only the raw image and the sequence of processing steps, that is the sequence of node activations as input. So this is the architecture. It's composed of multiple component processes that we deem to be necessary and sufficient for this task. I'm going to go through all of them in detail, but for now I'm just going to sketch what is necessary. So we need a perceptual system that represents the visual input in terms of its features. We need an attentional system that is able to guide attention to objects in the scene based on their feature values. We need a rudimentary conceptual system that allows to ground feature concepts like cactus or horizontal or red in perception by creating peaks at appropriate positions in the feature attention fields. We need a relational system that allows to ground spatial relations between target objects and reference objects. And yeah, these three components, so perceptions, the perception system, the relation system, the attention system, and the conceptual system have been presented in previous architectures. So for example, 2 days ago, Professor Schöner presented the Lipinski et al. Model, which is part of that. And Mathis yesterday presented the spatial language model, which allows to ground individual relations between objects. And now our goal is to extend this by the capacity to ground nested patterns of relations. So for this, we first need to introduce a target search mechanism that allows to keep track of target candidates that at the current stage of processing are still viable candidates for the object that we want to ground, and that are iteratively reduced or eliminated as additional characteristics are mentioned. So for example, we might start with all blue objects and say, yeah, but it's not only blue, it's also horizontal. And then we narrow that down. Yeah, it's not only blue and horizontal, but it's above the cactus, something like that. And this, as these additional characteristics are listed, the target candidates are iteratively reduced to a subset with all the mentioned characteristics so far. The next thing that we need to introduce is what we call a mental map, which is a working memory of previously grounded objects. So each time an object is selected as the target of a certain subclause, subphrase, or sentence, a peak is created in the mental map, which may then later be reused. So we might later then refer back to previously grounded objects by attending to them from the mental map. And finally, we need a process organization system, which I already hinted at in the introduction, which is the interface to the language component of the to the language preprocessing system. So the process nodes and the concept nodes comprise the interface to the language preprocessing system, and that system guides the architecture only by activating appropriate process nodes and appropriate concept nodes at appropriate moments in time. And these comprise essentially encode the words and their grammatical arrangement. Okay, let's zoom in on the perceptual system. So you have probably already seen this, at least for the color feature. So we assume that visual pre-processing extracts feature values that provide input into a three-dimensional field for each feature. In the case of color, you know this already, that field is defined over the two spatial dimensions of the visual input and an additional hue dimension. And peaks in that field reflect the fact that an object with a certain color is present at a certain spatial location. So for example, the three green cacti each create peaks in the green region of that field at their appropriate spatial locations. Analogously, the orientation space perception field is defined over the two spatial dimensions and an additional orientation angle dimension, and the shape space perception field is defined over the two spatial dimensions and an additional discrete shape dimension. So for instance, the camel creates a peak on its spatial position in the camel region of this field. Okay, that was the perceptual system. Let's now zoom into the attentional system, or what might also be called visual search system. This is like a simplified version of models that you have already seen. We assume that for each feature, there's a feature space attention field that couples feature attention fields with the corresponding perception fields. So for example, there's a color space attention field defined over the spatial dimension of the visual input and an additional hue dimension. It receives sub-threshold input from the perceptual field and additional sub-threshold input from the color attention field. And if we create a peak in the color attention field, for example, in the green region, this causes slice input to be projected to the green region of the color space attention field, effectively causing objects with that color to be brought in the attentional foreground. And for the other two features, orientation and shape, we have a completely analogous mechanism. For example, creating a peak in the vertical region of the orientation attention field causes the orientation space attention field to form peaks on the spatial locations of all vertical objects, and creating a peak in the camel region of the shape attention field causes the shape space attention field to form a peak on the location of the camel shaped object. And one last thing, so this shape dimension is computed by similarity to a template. So you can see here that essentially this is a convolution of the visual input with kernels that are given by these shapes. The next thing are concept nodes, and you're already familiar with that as well. There's one node for each concept. For example, a yellow concept node that projects to the color attention field with a synaptic weight pattern that's that corresponds to a Gaussian centered on a prototypical yellow value, and upon activation of that node, the peak forms in the yellow region of the color attention field. And for the other features, it's completely analogous. So activating the horizontal node causes a peak to form in the horizontal region of the orientation attention field, and analogously for the shape concepts. And effectively then, by activating these concepts, we can ground the concepts in perception. That is, we can find objects by virtue of this attentional mechanism or visual search mechanism. And all of these color space attention field project into a two-dimensional spatial attention field, and thereby effectively cause a peak to form on the spatial locations to which the activated concept applies. Okay, so the next mechanism that we're going to zoom into is the target search mechanism. And we've already gone through this example 2 times essentially. So the idea is that initially we select a set of target candidates using the visual search mechanism that with all the, by selecting all objects with the firstly mentioned characteristic. So in a sentence like, there's a cactus below the tent and above the camel, we first select all cacti as target candidates for the subphrase, there's a cactus. And then the sentence continues below the tent. So we eliminate all target candidates that are not below the tent, or formulated differently, we reduce the target candidates to a subset that is also below the tent. And we do the same again as and above the camel is mentioned. So there's a cactus below the tent and above the camel. So we reduce the remaining target candidates to the one cactus that is both below the tent and above the camel. And this is not just a blind guess. There are psychophysical studies listed here, which show that this is actually, this is called the visual world paradigm, and this is an eye tracking study, and this is an EEG study. No, this is a review of studies. Amongst these are eye tracking and EEG studies that essentially show that this is how attention is guided as we listen to an unfolding discourse. So attention is narrowed down step by step, sequentially, as additional features are mentioned. Okay. No, I actually want to show you a video now of how we implement the target search mechanism in the architecture. So we introduce a target candidate fields that contains peaks on the spatial locations of all objects that at the current stage of processing are still viable candidates for the object that is currently grounded. So initially, in this example, it creates peaks on the 3 cacti. And these are then iteratively eliminated. For this purpose, we introduce a reduction field that receives input from the target candidates field and the spatial attention field. And effectively, that reduction field thus forms peaks on the spatial locations of all target candidates that presently receive spatial attention. Right now, these are still all of them, but when spatial attention is taken away from the cacti, the target candidates field is self-sustained, so it retains the peaks on the 3 candidate cacti, and now the phrase continues. So it started with there's a cactus, and now it continues with below the tent. So spatial attention is directed to all cacti that are below the tent, and this causes peaks to form in the reduction field on the spatial location of all cacti that are below the tent. And now we want to eliminate the other candidates from the target candidates field. So for this purpose, there is excitatory input from the reduction field to the target candidate field, and inhibitory input from the process organization system. Effectively, this causes peaks in the target candidates field to decay if they do not receive excitatory support from the reduction field. So here, the peak that is that is not below the tent disappears from the target candidates field. And this process continues analogously as the sentence continues. So the sentence was, there's a cactus below the tent and above the camel. So now all remaining target candidates that are not above the camel are attended, cause a peak to form in the reduction field, and the inhibitory input causes the other peak to decay from the target candidates field, causing only the one target candidate that's both below the tent and above the camel to remain. Okay. So the next, one last thing. When a single target candidate remains, it is selected in the target selection field, which just receives input from the target candidates field, but is selective so that in case multiple candidates remain, a single one is selected, and it achieves global excitatory input from the process organization system when the phrase is finished. The next thing that we're going to introduce is a mental map, which is our term for working memory of representations of previously grounded objects, of objects that were the targets of previous sentences. So each time a sentence or a phrase that describes an object ends, it is stored in the mental map. And here's how that is done. So when the target selection field forms a peak, it provides excitatory input to all the mental map fields. So there's one mental map field for each feature. These are defined over the same dimensions as their corresponding perception fields. So there's a color space mental map defined over space and hue, orientation space mental map additionally defined over angle, and shape space mental map defined over the discrete shape dimension. And they receive subthreshold input from their respective perception field. And when that subthreshold input coincides with input from the target selection field, the mental map forms a self-sustained peak, effectively causing these fields to retain a representation of each grounded object in terms of its features. So here the cactus has been selected, so there's a peak at the position of the cactus in the target selection field, and as a result, the color space mental map forms a peak at that position in the green region, which essentially says there's the green region at this position, which we just grounded. There's a vertical object at that position, and there's a cactus shape object at that position. And together then, these three peaks are the representation of the grounded object in working memory. And why do we need that? If a sentence continues by saying, for example, find the blue object above that cactus, not just above any cactus, but above the cactus that has previously been described, we need to be able to attend to an object from the mental map instead of the perceptual input. This is not the only use case, so we might also say, find the blue object above the previously described green object, or above the previously described vertical object, no matter what word we originally used. And in order to be able to attend from objects in the mental map instead of the perceptual input, we introduce a gating mechanism, which essentially causes input into the color space attention field, which, as you may recall, is used for visual search. That input is gated, and the input from the perceptual fields only goes through when the from mental map node is off, and input from the mental map only goes through when the from mental map node is on. So this gating mechanism is implemented by means of gating fields that just receive either a global excitatory boost or a global inhibitory input, effectively causing only the object representations from either the perceptual fields or the mental map fields to go through to the feature space attention fields, depending on the state of activation of the from mental map node. And finally, we need a relational system, which is completely identical to what Mattis presented yesterday and what Professor Schöner presented about the Lipinski model 2 days ago. It just transforms the positions of the target candidates into a coordinate system that is centered on the reference object. So this is a neural coordinate transform, and as a result, a spatial relation field forms subthreshold peaks on the spatial locations of all target candidates that are relative to the reference object, and that field receives additional input from any activated spatial relation concept node, which has synaptic weights that correspond to the characteristic spatial pattern. So here the above node is activated, causing the above spatial pattern to be fed in there. And as a result, the spatial relation field forms peaks on the relative position of the target candidate that is above the reference cactus. And the peaks in the spatial relation field are transformed back into the coordinate system of the visual input and project into the spatial attention field. So as a result, then the spatial attention field here has a peak on the blue object, on the blue target candidate, which is above the reference cactus. And this can then serve in a subsequent processing step, again, as input to the reduction field, and inhibitory input to the target candidate field may then eliminate all blue objects that do not receive support from the reduction field, that is, all blue objects that are not above the cactus. Okay, finally, I'm going to show you a video of the relevant fields of the architecture in action as it grounds the sentence. So the first step, there's a cactus. We activate the select target candidates node and the cactus node, causing spatial attention to be guided to all cacti, which are stored in the target candidates field. Then the second node that gets activated is the select reference node in conjunction with the tend node. Actually, I forgot something. I first have to tell you how the process nodes achieve their effect via their connections to the fields of the architecture. So there's a select target candidates process, which is activated in conjunction with a feature concept node and provides global excitatory input to the target candidates field. Thus, effectively, the objects with the activate feature concept nodes get stored in the target candidates field. This is an example for that. So select target candidates cactus causes all cacti to be stored in the target candidates field. There's a reduced target candidates node, which inhibits the target candidates field, causing all peaks to decay that do not receive support from the reduction field, and it is activated in conjunction with any concept node, either a feature concept node in case we want to list features like the red diagonal cactus or the vertical blue camel, and as these features are subsequently attended, we can eliminate target candidates. Next process is the select target process, which provides global excitatory input to the target selection field, causing that field to make a selection decision among one of the remaining target candidates, and it is called at the end of sentences. And the select reference process, which provides global excitatory input to the reference field, allowing that field to form a peak on an attended spatial location. And an example for that would be selecting the cactus from the mental map, which would then be activated in conjunction with the from mental map node that causes the reference object to be selected from the mental map. And okay, back to the video. Here I go through the sequence of processing steps, and the bottom part shows the target candidates field, the reference field, the spatial relation field, and the target selection field as these processing steps are processed. So initially, select target candidates cactus causes 3 cacti to be stored in the target candidates field. Then select reference tend causes the tend to be stored in the reference field, causing the spatial relation field to form peaks on the positions of the target candidates that are below the tend, here the 2 cacti, which then goes back to the spatial attention field and causes through activation of the eliminate target candidates process, causes peaks in the target candidates field to decay, which are not below the reference object. Then we want to select that the sentence continues above the camel. So we want to select the camel as reference object. It's attended and stored in the reference field, and then peaks start to form above all target candidates that are above the camel, which is only 1. And again, activating the eliminate target candidates node in conjunction with the above spatial pattern causes the spatial relation field to form a peak on the target candidate that is above the camel. And then again, inhibitory input to the target candidate's field causes the other peak to decay. So effectively, the target candidate's field only retains a peak on the cactus that's both below the tent and above the camel. And yeah, then we select that as the target of the first phrase in the target selection field. And we continue with the second phrase, find the blue object above that cactus. So we start by activating the select target candidates node and the blue node, causing all blue objects to be stored in the target candidates field. Then we continue by selecting a reference object, which is a cactus. And by activating the from mental map node, we make sure that the cactus from the mental map is selected so that the reference field then forms a peak on the spatial location of the cactus from the mental map. And then we activate that. The sentence goes, find the blue object above that cactus. So we eliminate all blue target candidates that are not above the selected reference cactus. Again, spatial relating field forms peaks on their relative positions. Spatial attendant field forms peak on the absolute position. And yeah, through the reduction field and inhibition to the target candidates field, only that peak remains in the target candidates field. And finally, we select the target of the whole phrase in the target selection field. Okay. You may now ask your questions.